I wanted to do something I don't normally do and respond to a YouTube video.
The following is a World-Class Bullshitters exclusive.
I just saw WDW Pro's excellent coverage on the Star Wars toy sale disaster, and of course, WCBS has to take part in this conversation. The decline of Star Wars at retail has been well documented here on World Class Bullshitters. Since 2017, I've been out in stores watching the once glorious brand fall by the wayside. Now, new numbers have been released, and the situation keeps getting worse for Star Wars. But before we get into that, today's video is brought to you by me, Jeff Hicks, and my graphic novel, Stealing Solo. Stealing Solo asks the greatest what-if question of all time. What if a group of disgruntled Star Wars fans kidnap Harrison Ford and force him to remake Star Wars in their basement? That, and a whole lot more, is answered in Stealing Solo, a Captain's Parody. Stealing Solo has been called Laugh Out Loud Funny and the greatest Star Wars parody since Spaceballs, and it's available now for a limited time only. Go to StealingSolo.com, which is powered by Shopify, so you get the reward-winning safety and security, and get yourselves a copy today. Once we sell through this limited backstock, I'm going back to the drawing board to bring you the sequel, which parodies Luke Skywalker's fall from grace, and finally the closing chapter, which I can't wait to get to, Frankenfisher, the Bride of Solo. And yes, it's exactly what you think it is. So folks, the only way to get that is go to StealingSolo.com right now, get yourselves a copy, and enjoy the greatest Star Wars parody since Spaceballs. Friend of the channel, WDW Pro, is in the midst of putting out a series of videos about the dwindling sales figures for Star Wars toys. In the video that you should all check out after this one, Pro goes into the details of just how poorly Star Wars is performing, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. In October 2012, Disney purchased Lucasfilm for just over $4 billion. At the time, fans were excited for new films, but Disney was focused elsewhere. The merchandise. While Star Wars may be a game changer in cinema, it's also a game changer for the toy industry. In early 1977, Star Wars meant very little, so the small Cincinnati-based toy company Kenner picked up the license. The toys Kenner produced were historic. Before Star Wars, most toys were larger than your average action figure. Some, like G.I. Joe, were roughly 12 inches. Many other lines of the day featured large-scale action figures with real clothing. But for Star Wars, Kenner would do something different. They introduced the 3.75-inch scale for Star Wars figures, so the figures could fit inside the spaceships and playsets. They were also cheap enough that kids could collect them all. The success of Star Wars caught Kenner off guard, so there were no Star Wars toys for 1977. But they would fix that by early 1978. Star Wars toys would continue to sell until 1985, where they were retired for a decade. In 1995, they returned with the Power of the Force 2 line. Since then, Star Wars toys have been a constant on toy shelves. Most of George Lucas's money came from Star Wars merchandise. While the movies made him millions of dollars, the merchandise made him billions. This Millennium Falcon chart represents how much money Star Wars has made before Disney. Over $33 billion in revenue, with $1.2 billion coming from rentals, $1.3 billion coming from other, $2 billion in books, $4.3 billion in DVD sales, $4.5 billion in box office sales, $4.7 billion in video game sales, and $15 billion in toy sales. Almost half of the $33 billion comes from Star Wars toy sales. That's an empire built on dreams. For collectors, the decline comes as no surprise. Back in 2013, when the first waves of Star Wars toys under Disney were released, the quality had dropped a lot. Star Wars toys were in a golden era. 2010 was the Empire Strikes Back 30th anniversary. That year saw a slew of new ships, new figures, new designs, and it was wonderful. A 30-year-old movie felt like a brand new movie on shelves. But once Disney took over, the line became kiddified. The articulation was minimized, the paint apps were minimized, the toys looked terrible. They didn't sell. We also were introduced to the Black Series. That would be the first time we would see Star Wars sold in a 6-inch scale. As the 3-inch line continued to dwindle, the 6-inch line slowly grew. By 2015, there was a Star Wars movie in theaters for the first time in a decade. That film, The Force Awakens, saw a huge merchandising push. In September of 2015, Force Friday took place. I took part in Force Friday myself, where I picked up a Chewbacca figure. I know, right? I really bought into the hype. The main reason is because the Black Series Chewbacca was incredibly difficult to find and sold for way more money than I was willing to pay on the aftermarket. So, instead of worrying about that, I just bought the new Chewbacca. It's Chewbacca. Could he change that much? Not really. He was just a different shade of brown. But this is where I come into the story. I started to notice that after Christmas of 2015, the Star Wars toys didn't really sell. They were still there. And I don't mean they were still on shelves. I mean they were exactly the same amount before Christmas as after Christmas on the shelves. Now, of course, I didn't think too much of this. I thought, well, stores restock, stores do this all the time. So I took a step back and I didn't overanalyze it. But a few weeks later, I would go back into stores and notice that it was the exact same amount of figures. So I would go over to my local Toys R Us to check it out, RIP Toys R Us, and the ships were still there too. As we slowly moved closer and closer to Rogue One and the merchandise was supposed to be released, I still saw a flood of The Force Awakens everywhere at retail. Those black and red boxes flooded retail for years. The release of Rogue One was no different. Though the film was successful, the toys stayed on shelves way longer than you would expect for a billion-dollar hit. Then 2017 happened. Before even The Last Jedi was released, I noticed the glut of Star Wars merchandise clogging the shelves. Every Toys R Us in my area had multiple Millennium Falcons, multiple X-Wings, the giant TIE Fighter, you name it, it was there. 2017's The Last Jedi changed nothing. As The Last Jedi merchandise was released, it was easy to find Force Awakens and Rogue One. Now you have to remember too, these things weren't all re-released. They were made once, stores bought them, and they were stuck there because people didn't buy them. Solo: A Star Wars Story did not fare any better, and finally to close out the trilogy, The Rise of Skywalker, probably suffered the worst because the prior years were so poor for Star Wars toys that The Rise of Skywalker would go on to be the only Star Wars theatrical film to not receive a toy line. The once historic film and merchandising brand had reached an all-time low, and it has never recovered since. There were many reasons why this happened. First off, the character choices weren't very good. No matter what the internet tells you, people did not like Rey, Finn, Poe, Kylo Ren, and the rest to buy them. They may talk about them online, they may identify with them online, but in reality, where it really matters, they weren't buying. Part of this comes from JJ's mystery box. The hype for The Force Awakens was massive. Not since The Phantom Menace had any film received that kind of pre-release hype. Marvel movies were big, but they weren't as big as Star Wars. That has since changed. J.J. Abrams is a filmmaker known for his mystery box tactics and deceit, and that did not work out very well for Star Wars. A lot of characters that people expected to be big hits had an action figure made, and those action figures never sold. Characters like the Guavian Enforcer or Count Zuvio were barely in the film, if in the film at all. Those characters would clog up store shelves, but so would main characters like Rey, Finn, and Poe. And even the iconic Han Solo would not sell anymore. That was the biggest impact those films had on society. Not for their quality, not for their great cinema techniques. They killed Star Wars at retail. And the next few years would create a stockpile of unsellable merchandise. Now, of course, there are other reasons as well, including the increase in video game sales, increase in digital content, and more. But the collector base that kept Star Wars alive for all of these years stopped buying as well. They didn't like the films, they didn't feel like they were treated justly, and the end result was not good for Disney. Also at the time, the superhero film was dominating. The Avengers had come out in 2012, and the subsequent Marvel films were all big hits. On the retail shelves, superheroes were a much more attractive purchase. A character like Captain America, Iron Man, Superman, Batman, Hulk, Spider-Man, they could all do a lot. They were superheroes. Star Wars toys were just people with guns. It was the ship that you had to buy to get the big play features, and Hasbro, they cut corners on the ships. Their Millennium Falcon was a lot smaller, their X-Wing was a lot smaller, and that turned off collectors, and the kids were never interested in the first place. Now, in 2023, we're talking about how sales have declined 65%. The reveal in Pro's video is very interesting, so make sure you guys are watching that video to check that out. But the real reason lies somewhere in the middle of all this. Toy sales have fluctuated over the years, but nothing has performed as bad as Star Wars. The reason it's so shocking is that Star Wars was the biggest toy line ever. Stores would alter the way they did business because Kenner's initial offerings were in such high demand. According to Pro's video, every Star Wars Kenner year was bigger than all of Disney's Star Wars years combined. Remember, for decades, fans would happily buy new and updated versions of the original trilogy characters, and some prequel trilogy characters. Thanks to Disney, that tried and true formula failed after the sequel trilogy hit. Now Han, Luke, and Leia don't sell anymore, and can be found at Ollie's for pennies on the dollar. Thanks, Disney. You ruined Star Wars. So folks, what do you think about this? What do you think about the WDW Pro video, and what do you think about our toy videos? Let me know in the comments below. Videos like Pro's back up what we've been saying and showing for years. Here on the channel, I've gone out to the stores across the country to film. I don't just stay in one localized region, I go all throughout the Midwest. And back when it existed, I hit every Toys R Us in the area, and there were multiple Toys R Us's here, and they all suffered the same problem. And you gotta remember too, this channel's based out of Cincinnati, the hometown of Star Wars. Star Wars has had a bigger impact on Cincinnati than any city in America, any city in the world, realistically. When you think of Star Wars, you think of fictional planets, fictional worlds, fictional cities. But here in Cincinnati, Star Wars was a big deal. There's even a mural painted downtown with vintage Star Wars figures, and it's city approved, so it's not just some graffiti art, but it's a beautiful piece, and it shows you the importance of that brand here in this city. Former Kenner employees have not seen the glut of Star Wars like they do now. It's shocking on every front. And it just goes to show you that Disney got into the Star Wars business for all the wrong reasons. Money is the right reason, but the way you go about making it should be done with a little more style, a little more class. World class, that is. So folks, if you want something with style and class, go to stealingsolo.com right now. You're already a Star Wars fan, and you're already a collector, but have you collected the greatest Star Wars parody since Spaceballs? Probably not, but there's a limited supply left, and you can get it right now at stealingsolo.com. StealingSolo.com is powered by Shopify, so you get the award-winning safety and security, and I ship out books all the time. International shipping is available, and folks, we're almost through the supply of books. And like I always say, once we sell all of them, I'll go back to the drawing board to work on the sequel about Luke Skywalker, and finally, Frankenfisher, The Bride of Solo, which you all want to read, and I cannot wait to create. So folks, the way to get that trilogy is to go to StealingSolo.com right now, get yourself a copy of the greatest Star Wars parody since Spaceballs, and enjoy. And folks, when your copy arrives, tag us on social media to tell us what you think about the book. I'll be back next time with more, but in the meantime, be smart, be safe, be cool, but always be excellent to each other. Thanks for watching today's video. Yes, it's over, but don't cry because there's more, a lot more from World Class Bullshitters. And there's only one way to get it. Hit that subscribe button below. When you do that, you'll get notifications and updates from World Class Bullshitters every time we go live. Basically, you won't miss anything. And if there's one thing I hate, it's FOMO. But the thing most people hate more than FOMO is fear of missing out on World Class Bullshitters, because there's just some things you can't undo. So folks, do yourselves a favor and never miss anything from World Class Bullshitters. One last thing before you go, hit the thumbs up button. Not for our egos, no, they're big enough as this, but it does help us fight the algorithm here, and well, it's man versus machine, and that's the real fight. But if that's not your battle, that's okay. There's one last way you can help WCBS, and that's going over to shopwcbs.com, picking up a t-shirt, a beer glass, a sweatshirt, a poster, all sorts of ways to back WCBS. The difference between us and other YouTube channels is I'm the artist that makes all this stuff, so if you enjoy art beyond t-shirts, you can even read our comic books. We got it all. We're called the epitome of pop culture for a reason, and no, again, it's not for our egos. So folks, make sure you're involved with every aspect of World Class Bullshitters, not just for us, but do it for yourself. We're making the change in entertainment everybody out there wants to see. And a special thank you goes out to all of our wonderful patrons who make this content possible. Go to patreon.com/worldclassbs to get involved and help out the channel.